Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The moment he stepped into the room, the air itself seemed to change, thickening with an almost electric anticipation. He moved with a quiet authority, his eyes locking onto mine, pulling me in a way I couldn't resist even if I wanted to. There was something dangerous in the way he approached, a tension that coiled around us like a living thing, and I could feel it in my chest, each heartbeat a drumbeat of warning and desire. My husband stood just behind me, rigid, silent, his gaze unwavering as if trying to measure the invisible thread connecting us, yet unwilling or maybe unable to intervene. His hand pressed against the wall beside my head, just inches from mine, holding me in place with a force that spoke of control and certainty. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the subtle brush of his sleeve against my arm, the small shifts of weight that seemed to map the space between us like an unspoken conversation. My husband's presence behind me was grounding, but it also made every moment more charged, more urgent. There was a question in the room, one no one dared to answer aloud, about what might happen if that thread snapped. I tried to focus on something else, the soft hum of the room, the shadows cast by the lamp, the faint scent of cologne that clung to him. But every attempt to distract myself only heightened my awareness. His gaze was intense, almost predatory, yet strangely intimate, scanning the contours of my expression for reactions I didn't even know I was giving. It was a silent dance, a push and pull of restraint and temptation, and the energy between us was palpable. My husband's eyes, dark and calculating, never left us, witnessing the chemistry that neither of us could fully explain, the electricity in the air that felt both thrilling and forbidden. There was a moment, brief and fleeting, when our worlds seemed to shrink to the space of that room alone. A flicker of hesitation, a brush of movement, and the air between us vibrated with unspoken questions. Who were we in this space? What were we daring to feel? Every instinct told me to step back, to retreat to safety, but the magnetic pull held me, tethered by curiosity, desire, and the inexplicable sense that boundaries were meant to be tested. My pulse raced, my thoughts scattered, and yet I felt an odd clarity. Nothing would remain the same after this moment. And then, just as quickly as it began, time seemed to hang, suspended in that breathless pause. A single glance, a subtle shift of weight, a breath caught in the chest. It was enough to promise that the room's tension was only the beginning, that the fire between us had been lit, and that the night ahead would be charged with questions neither of us could answer yet. The story of that room, of those two men and the space I occupied between them, was just starting. And I knew deep in my bones that nothing about this encounter would leave us unchanged. The room seemed smaller now, as if the walls had leaned in to listen, to bear witness to the silent storm between us. He didn't speak, yet every subtle movement spoke volumes. When his hand shifted slightly on the wall, my pulse jumped, though I didn't let it show. I caught his gaze lingering on me, not demanding, not accusing, just searching. And I realized with a shiver that I was searching back. My husband's presence behind me should have been grounding, a tether to reality, but it only made the air heavier, more charged. I could feel him, the quiet tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darkened ever so slightly as he watched the interaction unfold. I wondered if he felt the same pull I did, if he was as caught between curiosity and restraint as I was. The room had become a delicate balance of energy, each of us aware of the unspoken rules, yet teetering dangerously close to crossing them. When he leaned just a fraction closer, our breaths nearly mingling, the brush of his sleeve against my arm sent a cascade of awareness through me. I wanted to move, to escape, but my body stayed rooted, a silent participant in a tension-filled dance I didn't fully understand. His eyes flicked to my lips for a split second, then back to my eyes, and I felt a heat rising that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was something older, something stubbornly alive, a mix of longing and restraint. We spoke without words, every glance was a sentence, every subtle gesture a paragraph in the story we were writing with our bodies and minds. I felt the pull of him, a magnetic force that refused to be ignored, and yet I also felt the pull of loyalty, of something safe behind me. It was a collision of instincts, one that left me trembling with anticipation and confusion. He exhaled slowly, just enough that I could hear it, and I realized that the space between us was stretching and shrinking at the same time, a silent negotiation of boundaries. I wanted to speak, to break the tension with sound, but the words felt dangerous, too revealing, so we stood there in suspended time, letting the room hum with possibilities. And then when our hands accidentally brushed while he adjusted his stance, I couldn't help but feel it, an electric jolt that ran from my fingertips straight to my chest. We both froze, eyes locking, and for a moment the world outside the room disappeared. Nothing else existed but that touch, that glance, that unspoken acknowledgement that we were dancing on the edge of something neither of us could name. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. The story had not reached its climax, in fact it had only begun to simmer. The tension, the attraction, the forbidden pull, all of it lingered in the air, leaving us suspended, caught between desire and reason, knowing that the next moment could change everything. And yet neither of us moved because in that pause the intensity of what we felt was more than enough. The air between us had grown heavier, charged with a quiet intensity that seemed almost unbearable. Every movement, no matter how small, felt amplified, as if the walls themselves were watching, holding their breath along with us. He leaned slightly closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and I felt a flutter I couldn't name. It was tempting to turn, to close the tiny distance, to surrender to the pull that had been building since the moment he entered the room. But I didn't. I couldn't. My husband's presence behind me was a tether I couldn't ignore. His eyes were still fixed on us, unwavering, calm yet alert, a silent reminder of the boundaries none of us wanted to cross. I knew he sensed the electricity too, felt it in the subtle curve of my spine, the quickened rhythm of my pulse. Yet he said nothing, and that silence made everything sharper, every stolen glance more dangerous, every accidental brush of hands more electric. We were teetering on a line drawn by years of trust, loyalty, and unspoken agreements. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to let our eyes meet in that long, loaded moment. I felt the weight of his gaze, heavy and intimate, and the corners of my heart tightened. There was history I didn't know, a depth of emotion hidden behind the confident exterior he wore like armor. And I knew I was drawn not just to him but to the parts of him that no one else could see. When our fingers brushed an almost careless movement as he adjusted his stance, the jolt was undeniable. A spark leapt between us, a tangible thread connecting our bodies and minds. I froze, half from shock, half from desire, and he paused too, eyes widening just slightly. Neither of us moved forward, because to do so would be to leap into something neither was ready to name. And yet the pull remained, constant, magnetic, impossible to ignore. I wanted to speak, to break the tension with words, but the right words didn't exist. Anything I said would either confess too much or betray too little. So I stayed silent, letting the moment linger, letting the desire hang in the air like a living, breathing thing. He lingered too, aware of the distance between us, aware of how close we could be without crossing the line. And for a moment it felt as though time had slowed, stretched out, leaving us suspended in a state of longing that was at once intoxicating and unbearable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he stepped back, just enough to restore a fraction of space between us. Not because he didn't want it, far from it, but because he wanted it too much. Because the weight of the tension, the intensity of the feeling was enough to make restraint feel like survival. And as the room returned to a quieter hum, the unspoken truth remained. We were both caught in the same web of desire and restraint. Aware that the pull was real, undeniable, and far from over. The room had become a universe of its own, shrinking to the space that held the three of us and the invisible charge between us. Every glance, every movement was magnified. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder. Every creak of the floor beneath us a reminder of how fragile the moment was. I could feel him there, almost touching, almost breaking through the invisible wall we had built around ourselves. He stepped slightly closer, just enough for the warmth of his body to brush against mine. The contact was fleeting, accidental, and yet it carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. My breath caught shallow and uneven, and I realized that the tension wasn't just between him and me, it was a shared current that my husband felt too. In the steady weight of his gaze behind me, in the calm vigilance of his presence. It was a strange, dizzying mix of restraint and desire, trust and temptation. I shouldn't. His voice was barely audible, a whisper that carried more meaning than words ever could. The hesitation in it made my chest tighten. I didn't respond, didn't need to. The confession hung in the air like a living thing, settling over us, settling in me. It was not a declaration of surrender, but of awareness, acknowledgement of the electric pull that had been simmering for hours, days, maybe years. Our eyes locked, and in that gaze I saw everything I couldn't say aloud. The curiosity, the restraint, the hunger that was almost unbearable. I felt my fingers twitch, aching to reach out, yet knowing that the smallest movement could shatter the delicate equilibrium we had maintained. And then our hands brushed again, just a whisper, a ghost of contact, but it felt monumental, as if the air between us had ignited. Time slowed, every sound faded into the background except the thrum of our hearts, synchronized in a rhythm that neither of us could control. I wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but I didn't. He wanted the same, I knew it, and that mutual restraint made the tension even more exquisite. The room was charged with unspoken truths, each second stretching longer than the last, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. A soft exhale escaped me, barely audible, and he responded with a mirrored breath. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. It was a silence filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't dared to do, yet everything we both felt. It was intimate, raw, and almost unbearable. The space between us was electric, alive with potential, trembling on the edge of something that neither of us could name but both of us could feel. And then, nothing moved. We were caught in that suspended instant, teetering on the brink of revelation, of contact, of confession. The story had reached its most intimate emotional point, charged with heat and longing, yet carefully held in the fragile balance of what could and couldn't happen. The room itself seemed to pulse with our restraint, leaving the reader, leaving us hanging on the precipice of everything about to explode. The rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft rhythm that mirrored the beating of our hearts. The room glowed with a muted warmth, the light spilling from a single lamp, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Everything outside seemed distant, almost unreal, leaving only the three of us suspended in a fragile golden bubble. The tension that had built over hours, days, finally found its release, not in words but in proximity, in presence. He leaned closer and I could feel the heat of him without a single touch. Her breath mingled with mine in the space between us. Slow, shallow, charged. Every inch of distance felt impossible, every heartbeat a countdown, and yet we moved carefully, deliberately, savoring the moment before it vanished. The room seemed to exhale with us, carrying the quiet intensity that had been simmering, letting it bloom into something that was almost palpable. When our fingers brushed, it was electric, a spark that ran up my arm and settled into my chest. Not because of desire alone, but because of everything else. Trust, curiosity, longing, and the secret acknowledgement that we were exactly where we needed to be. Words weren't necessary, our bodies spoke in a language older than speech. A tilt of a shoulder, a leaning in, a whispered inhale, all of it conveyed what we could not say aloud. My husband's presence behind me was grounding, steady, yet also part of the rhythm. There was no jealousy, no tension that needed resolving, only awareness, a shared understanding that this moment belonged to the three of us in its own fragile, perfect way. His hand rested lightly on my waist, steady, reassuring, while I felt the magnetic pull of him before me, the subtle brush of heat and breath that made my pulse race. The rain outside grew louder, drumming softly against the glass, and I closed my eyes, letting the world narrow to the room, to the warmth, to the shared intimacy of connection. Her breath melted into his, a soft sigh of acknowledgement, and I felt a thrill in that closeness. Our bodies, careful yet urgent, spoke the words we couldn't say, confessions carried on the tips of fingers, in glances, in the infinitesimal brush of skin. It was both gentle and breathtaking, electric and tender, intoxicating without a single explicit motion. Time lost its meaning, every second stretched into eternity, every touch a novel, every look a confession. The room was alive with quiet heat, the kind that lingers long after the moment passes. And in that glow of understanding, of shared closeness, I realized that nothing had to be spoken, nothing had to be done. The connection itself, the breathing, the brushing, the hearts aligned, was enough. The night held us, suspended in its soft, dripping rain, letting us finally feel what we had been holding back for so long. It was perfect, elegant, and intimate, an emotional peak where restraint and desire had found harmony, leaving us trembling with satisfaction yet fully whole. Morning light spilled softly through the blinds, painting the room in pale golds and muted shadows. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving a quiet freshness in the air, but the room was heavy with memory. The closeness, the tension, the surrender of the night lingered like smoke, intangible yet impossible to ignore. Silence settled over us, thick and intimate, as if the room itself was holding its breath, giving space for hearts to catch up with themselves. I sat by the window, tracing patterns on the glass with a fingertip, and felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and guilt. The world outside was moving, indifferent, but inside time had slowed. He remained near me, leaning lightly against the doorway, watching without speaking. Our eyes met occasionally, small sparks igniting in the quiet, but nothing had to be said. The conversation of the night had happened in glances, in gentle touches, in the warmth of presence that lingered longer than words could. My husband moved softly around the kitchen, preparing coffee, the sounds of his movements grounding me. There was no anger, no need for confrontation, just a careful rhythm that respected what had transpired. His silence was steady, contemplative, yet attentive. It was clear that the night had changed something fundamental among us. We were not the same three people who had entered the room yesterday. Something deeper had threaded itself through the fabric of our connection, binding us in a quiet understanding that would take time to unravel, to comprehend. A soft laugh escaped me unbidden at the memory of our near confessions and the subtle electricity that had hummed between us. He, the one from the night, smiled faintly, a shadow of acknowledgement passing over his features. It wasn't triumph or possession, only recognition of something mutual, something that had grown without words. And yet in the middle of all that warmth, a knot of unease lingered. Was it love? Was it need? Or merely the thrill of having touched a line previously forbidden? The calm of the morning was broken suddenly by a knock at the door. A surprise visitor, someone unexpected, carrying news or a question that threatened to ripple through the delicate balance we had just discovered. Hearts skipped a beat, tension flaring again, not from desire but from uncertainty. We looked at each other, understanding without speaking that this new twist would force us to confront the fragility of what had unfolded, to navigate the aftermath with care, honesty, and grace. And in that moment, amid the uncertainty and lingering tension, we felt the connection more keenly than ever. The night's heat had transformed into a quiet intimacy, a shared experience that left all three of us more aware of each other, more human, more alive. The morning was messy, yes, full of questions and quiet conflicts, but it was also full of possibility. The emotional threads that tied us together had deepened, weaving a pattern of longing, understanding, and restraint that neither time nor circumstance could easily unravel. The evening light slanted gently through the curtains, casting the room in a muted glow that softened every line, every shadow. There was no rush, no pressure, only the steady rhythm of hearts learning to settle after the storm. We moved quietly around each other, three people who had discovered something unexpected in one another, yet had emerged with a deeper sense of understanding, respect, and intimacy. She stood near the window, fingers brushing the sill, eyes tracing the fading light outside. He approached slowly, deliberately, and in the warmth of that space our hands found each other without speaking. A touch that was not possession, not claim, but acknowledgement, recognition of the journey we had shared, the tension that had built and finally found release. My husband remained nearby, calm, present, offering a steady anchor. His hand rested lightly on mine, his eyes soft, unguarded. There was no jealousy in the room, only a quiet acceptance, a shared awareness that intimacy can take many forms, and that love is sometimes woven in unexpected patterns. We lingered there, in that golden space, letting the silence carry meaning, letting every glance, every breath, every subtle gesture speak volumes. And then a simple closeness unfolded, lips brushed foreheads, fingers entwined loosely, shoulders pressed just enough to feel warmth without urgency. It was a soft, deliberate intimacy that had nothing to prove, nothing to say beyond the quiet truth that we were here, together, fully present, fully human. No words could capture it, no grand gesture could enhance it. It was in the simplicity of presence, the acknowledgement of connection, the gentle beating of hearts choosing peace. Outside, the evening deepened, the world moving on as we remained suspended in our own fragile, perfect rhythm. The room felt sacred in its ordinary way, warm, lived in, and full of memory. Whether the future would stretch forward with us side by side, or whether this moment would exist as a lingering perfume in memory, no one could say. Yet the impact of the night, the connection, the subtle tenderness we shared, would remain indelible. And so we let the moment breathe. We let it settle, like the calm after a storm, allowing ourselves to feel everything without needing to act. The intensity of our connection had softened into something enduring, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been felt, and what could be. Goosebumps traced the skin along my arms, tears threatened but never fell. We did not need them. The warmth, the shared breaths, the gentle pressure of lips against foreheads spoke for everything. The story closed not with finality but with resonance, a delicate shimmering note that lingered in the heart, an elegy to desire, understanding, and the unexpected beauty of connection.